Hey guys, tonight we begin with the raw, muddy, and downright funny and disgusting reality of a medieval battlefield. You probably imagine a battlefield as trumpets blaring, swords clashing, and heroic speeches echoing over the hills. In reality, your first opponent isn't a knight or an arrow, it's the smell. And let me tell you, it's undefeated. Picture thousands of men who consider bathing optional, as in maybe once a year if the river isn't frozen. Their tunics are stiff with old sweat, stale ale, and mystery stains no one wants to investigate. Then add horses, because nothing says glory like wading through half a ton of hay-fed digestive output. But wait, there's more. Soldiers have been sleeping in muddy camps, tossing leftovers on the ground, and relieving themselves wherever they please. It's less field of honour and more giant outdoor dumpster fire. You're not breathing air so much as sipping a medieval smoothie of everything you never wanted to taste. The veterans don't even notice. They're used to it. The guy next to you casually sharpens his spear while you're doubled over dry heaving, wondering why no one mentioned this in the training manual. He gives you a look that says, "First battle, huh?" And you realise, yes, you've already embarrassed yourself before the fighting even begins. And this is before anyone swings a weapon. You're supposed to be bracing for the charge, but your body is staging a rebellion against your nose. You wanted to stand tall and look heroic, but instead, you're gagging like you've just walked into the world's worst tavern latrine. Modern people underestimate this because we live in a world of soap, deodorant, and garbage trucks. You can handle a crowded subway on a summer afternoon, maybe even a weekend music festival without showering. Now multiply that by 10,000, add livestock, and crank the humidity to unholy. That's your battlefield. So no, you don't get your glorious opening charge. You get watery eyes, a spinning head, and the strong urge to lie down until the breeze changes direction. Unfortunately, there is no breeze. Only a wall of odour so thick it feels like it could be bottled and sold as eau de desperation. And that's the real ambush. Not steel, not arrows, just the air itself. Before the first blow is struck, you've already lost to medieval hygiene. You thought armour would make you look like a hero. You pictured yourself striding across the field, sunlight bouncing off polished steel, peasants gasping at your radiant presence. Reality check. Armour isn't a fashion statement. It's a medieval sauna you can't take off. First problem, the weight. A full suit can be 50 to 70 pounds, and it doesn't distribute evenly. You're waddling around like a metal turtle, and every step feels like you're sinking into the earth. Want to swing a sword? Sure, but only once, because by the second swing your arms are shaking like overcooked noodles. Second problem, the heat. Inside that helmet it's not heroic. It's suffocating metal oven. Your breath fogs up the visor until you can't see, and the only breeze you feel is the faint whiff of your own stale air. If you do manage to peek through the slits, congratulations. Your reward is realising you still can't move fast enough to dodge anything. Third problem, falling over. In the movies, knights charge through chaos like unstoppable tanks. In reality, if you trip in mud, you're done. You don't pop back up gracefully. You flail on the ground, arms and legs clanking like a dropped toolbox, while everyone else tramples past. At best, a friend drags you upright while rolling his eyes. At worst, you get left there, until someone decides your armour looks better without you in it. And let's not forget the smell. Remember Chapter 1? Now imagine that smell trapped inside a steel can with you. Every bead of sweat just soaks your padding until you're basically wearing a sponge that reeks of despair. Knights trained for years to endure this misery. You? You've barely handled carrying groceries up the stairs. After 10 minutes in armour, you're praying for a cool breeze, a chair, and maybe a sports drink. But there are no chairs, no breezes, and the only drink is warm ale that tastes like regret. So yes, armour makes you look impressive, from a distance. Up close, you're staggering, wheezing, and trying not to pass out. Far from invincible, you're basically a medieval baked potato waiting to be peeled. You imagine a medieval battle as sword against sword, face-to-face duels, and dramatic speeches. Reality, you're more likely to be introduced to an arrow before you even see the enemy. Archers were the medieval version of long-range customer service. Impersonal, efficient, and guaranteed to ruin your day. They didn't need to know your name or even see your face. All they had to do was aim in the general direction of a giant crowd of sweaty soldiers, and gravity handled the rest. The worst part? You don't hear the one meant for you. Arrows aren't cinematic. There's no warning whistle. No slow motion moment where you lock eyes with it. It's just suddenly there. 1 second you're clutching your spear, the next second someone in your row is on the ground, and you're wondering if it's your turn next. And medieval armies didn't use a handful of archers. They used thousands. The English longbowmen at Agincourt fired so many arrows they literally darkened the sky. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder with your nervous friends, looking up and realizing the weather forecast today is overcast, with a chance of sharp, pointy objects. Your armour, maybe it helps, but it's not perfect. Arrowheads were designed to slip through chainmail, splinter shields, and turn padded jackets into pincushions. If you were unlucky enough to be lightly equipped, you weren't just vulnerable, you were target practice. Even if you weren't hit, the psychological damage was real. Picture dozens of your comrades dropping around you in the opening minutes, all before you've even moved forward. Courage has a funny way of evaporating when the sky itself seems to be angry at you. The only defense was to raise your shield and hope. Which sounds fine, until you realize holding a shield over your head for more than 5 minutes feels like weightlifting punishment. Soon your arm shakes, the shield slips, and you find yourself peeking upward, praying the next volley doesn't come when you're taking a breather. So before the swords ever clash or the cavalry even arrives, there's a good chance you'd already be lying in the mud, muttering, "Really? That's how I go out?" The arrow doesn't care about your workout routine, your dreams of glory, or your brand new armor polish. It just shows up uninvited, like the worst party guest in history. You think the real threat on a medieval battlefield is the knight. Wrong. It's the giant half-ton animal he's riding. Horses weren't just transportation. They were biological battering rams with legs. And the moment you see one charging at you, you realize your place in history is to be part of the road. A warhorse isn't some friendly stable pony nibbling sugar cubes out of your hand. These were specially bred destriers, muscular, armoured, and trained to trample anything in their way. Picture 1 to 200 pounds of fury moving at 30 miles an hour. You don't fight that. You become part of the scenery. The sound alone is terrifying. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of hooves thundering across the field, making the ground shake. It doesn't feel like battle anymore. It feels like the earth itself is coming to flatten you. By the time the rider lowers his lance, you're already trying to decide whether you'd rather be squashed, skewered, or both. You think your spear will save you. Maybe, if you're standing firm in a disciplined formation, but you're not. You're panicking, sweating inside your armor-turned sauna, and wishing you'd stayed home to tend goats. The first rider bears down on you, and your spear shakes in your hands like it's made of paper. Horses can smell fear, or maybe they're just too focused on turning you into a speed bump to care. And if the lance doesn't get you, the sheer momentum will. People imagine knights jousting gracefully, but in a battle it's chaos. Riders crash through lines, horses kick sideways, and men go flying. One solid hoof to the chest, and you don't need a second opinion from a medieval doctor. You're finished. Even if you dodge the first wave, you're not safe. Cavalry doesn't politely take turns. They wheel around and charge again, trampling over whoever is unlucky enough to still be on the ground. At that point, you're less a soldier and more a patch of muddy carpet. In the stories, cavalry charges are noble and awe-inspiring. In reality, they're just terrifying. The knight might be aiming for honour, the horse is aiming for maximum flattening. And between the two, your odds of lasting even a minute shrink faster than your courage. You probably think your worst enemy on the battlefield is the opposing army. But the real danger? The guy standing right behind you. Welcome to the wonderful world of Friendly Fire Medieval Edition. Forget modern precision weapons. Medieval warfare was up close, chaotic, and sweaty. When thousands of men pack into a tight formation, swinging sharp objects around with shaky hands, somebody's bound to get jabbed in the wrong direction. And spoiler, it's usually you. First, there's the spear problem. Spears are long, unwieldy, and hard to aim in a crowd. The guy behind you is trying to poke the enemy, but instead he's poking the back of your leg. Congratulations, you've just become a shish kebab, and the battle hasn't even started properly. Then there are the swords. Forget elegant duels. Picture exhausted men swinging blindly in every direction, hoping they hit something that isn't wearing their own colours. With all the smoke, shouting, and general panic, they can't see you clearly anyway. If you're lucky, the worst you get is a dent in your helmet. If not, well, let's just say you won't be sending thank you notes to your teammates. And don't even get me started on archers. Arrows don't always go forward. Sometimes they misfire. Sometimes they bounce. Sometimes the wind just decides it doesn't like you. It's bad enough being terrified of the enemy's archers. It's worse realizing you also have to survive your own side's help. Even movement is hazardous. Picture this. Your commander yells, "Advance!" and everyone surges forward like an angry stampede. You stumble, fall, and before you can get up, 50 of your closest friends have already stepped on you. Not out of malice, of course. They're just trying not to die. Medieval courtesy had its limits. Veterans knew this. That's why they stood at the edges of formations, where the only danger was the actual enemy. You, however, are stuck in the middle, surrounded by amateurs who still can't tell their left from their right. Every time someone swings, you flinch, because half the danger is in your own ranks. So yes, the enemy might be terrifying. But sometimes survival means watching out for Steve from your own village, who's currently swinging his axe like he's chopping firewood, and doesn't realize your head is not a log. On the medieval battlefield, friendly was just a figure of speech. You've survived the smell, the arrows, the horses, and even Steve from your own village swinging his axe like a toddler with a stick. You're feeling pretty good, until you realize the battlefield itself is out to get you. Because in the Middle Ages, mud wasn't just mud. It was a weapon. Here's how it happens. Thousands of men and horses stomp across the same patch of ground for hours. It doesn't matter if you started on dry grass. Within minutes, it's been churned into soup. The kind of sticky, sucking sludge that clings to your boots and laughs at your attempts to move. Every step feels like you're trying to walk through porridge. Now imagine you're weighed down with 50 pounds of armour. You take one wrong step, sink knee-deep, and suddenly you're stuck. You try to pull your foot out, but your boot decides it would rather stay behind. You wobble, you fall, and before you know it, you're lying face first in medieval quicksand. And here's the fun part. No one's stopping to help you. Not because they don't care, but because they can't. When people are panicking and charging in every direction, you're just another obstacle in the mud. Soldiers step on you, horses splash over you, and the whole time you're trying to breathe through a helmet that's slowly filling with sludge. So much for your glorious duel under the sun. Even if you do manage to stand back up, you're exhausted. Your legs feel like lead, your armour is clogged, and every step is slower than the last. Meanwhile, arrows and cavalry don't care that you're basically fighting while standing in wet cement. You've become the easiest target on the field, and it wasn't just you. Whole armies bogged down in swampy terrain. At battles like Agincourt, knights drowned in mud before they even reached the enemy. Imagine being one of the most feared warriors of your age, only to be defeated by a puddle. Not exactly the ending you want sung about in taverns. So when you picture yourself standing tall and brave on a battlefield, don't forget the ground beneath your feet. Because in the Middle Ages, the earth itself seemed determined to drag you down. Literally. In short, you don't need an enemy to beat you. A muddy patch of farmland will do the job just fine. You've managed to stay on your feet through mud, arrows, and the occasional hoofprint to the ribs. You're telling yourself, okay, maybe I can survive this. And that's when it happens. Someone near you panics. And just like yawns in a crowded room, panic is contagious. It starts small. One soldier glances over his shoulder and notices that half the formation looks less like a disciplined army and more like a group of villagers playing dress-up with sharp objects. He mutters something, takes a step back, and suddenly his neighbour thinks retreat has begun. Within seconds, 3 more men are running. A minute later, the entire line is falling apart like a poorly baked pie. You want to be brave, to stand your ground, but bravery isn't all that attractive when everyone around you is bolting for the hills. Because here's the thing about human instinct. When 50 people sprint in one direction, your brain doesn't think, hold steady. It thinks, run, idiot. And medieval commanders knew this. That's why they screamed themselves hoarse, waving flags and blowing horns, trying to convince men to stand in neat little lines while cavalry thundered toward them. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. When it didn't, the field turned into a stampede of armoured men tripping over each other, with horses and wagons adding extra chaos to the mix. Here's the kicker. You don't even have to panic first. Someone else's fear infects you. You feel the rush of bodies, you hear shouts of retreat, whether it's true or not, and suddenly your spear is on the ground and your legs are running faster than your brain can process. You'll tell yourself later that you were being strategic, but deep down you know you just joined the medieval equivalent of a Black Friday sale crowd, only with more sharp edges. And panic wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. Soldiers crushed one another in the rush, wagons overturned, and men were trampled under their own comrades. You could survive arrows and lances, only to be flattened by your best friend because he couldn't handle the pressure. So yes, panic is contagious. On a battlefield, it spreads faster than the plague. And just like the plague, it rarely ends well for you. You always thought the battlefield would sound cinematic, trumpets blaring, swords ringing, maybe a few manly grunts. Instead, what actually breaks you isn't the fighting, it's the noise. The first thing you notice is the shouting. Thousands of men, all yelling at once. War cries, commands, curses, and the occasional, "Where's my shoe?" It's not a heroic chorus, it's chaos with lungs. You can't tell if your commander is telling you to advance, hold, or go home and milk the cows. Then come the drums and horns, supposedly meant to organise the army. In practice, they just add to the confusion. You hear one horn blast, but so does the enemy, and suddenly you're wondering if you just charged when you were supposed to stand still. Layered on top of that are the sounds of impact. Steel on steel doesn't make a noble clang. It screeches, scrapes, and jars your teeth. Every strike rattles your skull through the helmet, leaving you dazed like you've been ringing a bell with your head all afternoon. And then there are the horses. Horses don't politely whinny in battle, they scream. A war horse shrieking at full gallop is not majestic. It's the sound of nature reminding you that you are very small and very crushable. Now add in the human element. People don't die quietly. They groan, wail, and cry out for their mothers in voices that cut through the rest of the noise. You weren't prepared for that, and suddenly your grand fantasy of being a hero feels more like standing in the middle of a very loud nightmare. The result? You can't think. You can't focus. You can't even hear yourself breathe inside your helmet. Your brain just shuts down under the sound. That clever plan you had about staying calm under pressure? Gone. Your body is swinging wildly just to keep up, hoping you're hitting the right people. So no, you're not broken by a sword to the chest or an arrow in the leg. You're broken by the sheer, overwhelming noise of thousands of terrified, angry, desperate humans packed together. It's not glorious. It's deafening. And when you finally stumble out of the chaos, if you survive at all, your ears will still be ringing, a medieval souvenir you didn't ask for. You probably pictured yourself charging into battle with a gleaming sword, slashing left and right like the star of a historical epic. Hate to break it to you, swords are the most overrated weapon on the field. In fact, if you brought one, you've already made your first mistake. First, swords were expensive. Unless you were a noble or had a very generous employer, chances are you didn't even own one. You'd be stuck with a spear, an axe, or maybe just a sharpened stick if your lord was really cutting corners. Which is bad news, because in your fantasy, you were definitely the guy with the cool blade, not the one poking nervously from 10 feet away. Second, swords weren't even that practical. Spears dominated battlefields because they kept the danger far away, as in, over there with the other guy, not in your personal space. You, on the other hand, with your shiny sword, have to get up close. That means in order to look heroic, you've basically volunteered to step into stabbing range. Third, you're not trained. Knights trained from childhood to fight with heavy blades, practicing drills every day until their arms were like tree trunks. You, however, have spent most of your life scrolling, driving, and maybe going to the gym 3 times a week if you're really motivated. When you try to swing, it's less valiant strike, and more, why does my shoulder hurt already? And don't forget, battles weren't neat duels. They were packed, sweaty mobs where swinging a long blade was more likely to slice your neighbour than your enemy. In fact, many soldiers blunted their swords on purpose for close combat, turning them into glorified clubs. So much for your elegant swashbuckling. Even if you managed to land a hit, your sword probably wouldn't slice through armour like in the movies. Chainmail padded jackets and helmets were designed to resist blades. You'd swing with all your strength, and the other guy would just grunt, annoyed, before introducing you to his much more practical spear point. So yes, swords look great on movie posters and in museum displays, but on the battlefield, they're heavy, clumsy, and mostly symbolic. If you thought you'd be striding into glory with Excalibur in hand, think again. You're not King Arthur. You're just a tired guy holding a very expensive mistake. Congratulations, you've made it this far. You've dodged arrows, avoided being flattened by horses, and even survived Steve's accidental axe swing. But here's the thing. Even if the battlefield doesn't finish you, disease almost certainly will. Because medieval armies had one silent, patient warrior that never lost: germs. Let's start with the camps. You're living in a temporary city made up of thousands of stressed, sweaty soldiers crammed together. Everyone is eating from dirty pots, sharing spoons, and drinking the same lukewarm ale that's been sitting in a barrel since last week. Clean water? Don't make me laugh. If you drink from a stream, chances are you're also sipping whatever contribution the horses and soldiers upstream left behind. Then there's the food. You think you're a tough modern survivalist because you once ate a gas station hot dog. Try chewing on hard bread full of weevils or meat that smells questionable but probably won't make you sick. Spoiler. It does. And once it hits your stomach, you're out of the fight faster than any sword could manage. Infections? Oh, they're everywhere. Remember that tiny scratch you got on your hand while adjusting your armour? In a modern world, it's a band-aid situation. In the medieval world, it's an invitation for bacteria to throw a party. Within a week, your hand is swollen, you've got a fever, and the camp doctor is recommending either prayer or amputation. Sometimes both. And let's not forget the big names: dysentery, typhus, and plague. Dysentery alone could wipe out more soldiers than enemy swords ever did. It's hard to look heroic when you're spending most of the battle sprinting for the bushes. Typhus spreads like wildfire in crowded tents. And plague... well, let's just say you don't want to be in an army camp when that guest shows up. The cruel part? Disease didn't discriminate. Peasant or knight, you were all equally vulnerable. The fanciest armour in the world couldn't stop contaminated water or a flea bite. You might survive the battlefield itself, only to spend the next week curled up in agony, wondering if being stabbed would have been quicker. So, even if you escaped the mud, the arrows, and the horses, disease was waiting patiently in the wings, ready to claim you anyway. On a medieval battlefield, germs were the real champions, and you were always on their side. You might have thought the danger on a battlefield came from weapons, but no, it's the weather that finishes you off. Welcome to the medieval climate experience. Half sauna, half freezer, all misery. Let's start with the heat. You're wrapped in layers of padding, chainmail, and metal. Basically medieval winter wear in July. Within minutes, you're sweating like you're in a sauna with no exit. Your helmet traps every ounce of warmth until your brain feels like it's being slow cooked. You can't wipe your forehead because your hands are busy trying to hold your spear, so the sweat just pours into your eyes. Vision. Gone. Dignity. Gone. You tell yourself you'll push through, but then dizziness sets in. Heat exhaustion isn't glamorous. You're not collapsing dramatically after a noble duel. You're slumping like an overheated tourist at Disney World, except instead of a water bottle, you get a bucket of tepid ale that somehow makes things worse. And then, once the sun sets, the battlefield switches personalities. The heat disappears, and now you're shivering in damp clothes. You're lying on the ground. No tents, no sleeping bags, just grass that feels suspiciously like a sponge. That sweaty armour padding that baked you during the day, now it's an ice-cold sponge wrapped around your chest. There's no campfire luxury either. If you're lucky, maybe you huddle with a few equally miserable soldiers and share body heat. If you're unlucky, you're alone, teeth chattering loud enough to alert the enemy. The night is long, dark, and full of regrets. Mainly the regret that you didn't stay home and claim bad ankle when recruitment day came around. The worst part? This cycle repeats. Every day it's the same. Roasting during the battle, freezing during the night. Your body can't keep up. You're drained, dehydrated, and one strong gust of wind away from crying. Medieval warfare wasn't just about clashing armies. It was also about surviving the world's most punishing outdoor camping trip, only without marshmallows or s'mores to make it tolerable. So while the movies show heroic knights fighting tirelessly under banners, the truth is, half the army was either fainting in the sun or shivering in the dark. And you? You'd be doing both. You might assume that medieval soldiers marched into battle well-fed, ready to swing swords and shout slogans. Wrong. On the battlefield, food wasn't fuel. It was a punishment. Let's begin with the bread, if you can call it that. Hard as a rock, baked weeks ago, and crawling with little weevil roommates who are paying no rent. You don't eat the bread. You gnaw it, like a frustrated beaver, until your jaw aches. If you're lucky, you soften it in ale. If you're unlucky, You break a tooth and now have a dental emergency in the worst place on earth. Next up, meat. You dream of roast chicken, maybe a nice stew. Instead, you get salted pork that's been packed so long it smells like despair. Fresh meat exists, but only if you're quick enough to grab it before it spoils in the sun, or before the noblemen eat it all. For you, it's usually rancid scraps that test your stomach's loyalty. And let's just say stomachs are not loyal. Vegetables? Don't make me laugh. The closest you'll get to greens is the grass you collapse on when your digestion betrays you. Fruit, if it appears, is already fermenting. Congratulations, you've discovered the medieval version of kombucha, except instead of boosting your health, it sends you sprinting for the bushes. And water. Oh, precious water. Clean water is a fairy tale. Streams are shared with horses, laundry, and soldiers relieving themselves upstream. So your choice is, drink dirty water and gamble with disease, or stick with ale. Sounds good, right? Wrong. Ale isn't refreshing. It's warm, weak, and tastes suspiciously like someone tried to brew regret in a bucket. The result? You're constantly exhausted, dehydrated, and one bad meal away from being sidelined permanently. Instead of feeling strong and ready for battle, you're lightheaded, weak, and wondering if maybe the enemy camp has better catering. Spoiler. They don't. Meanwhile, your commander is eating fresh bread, roasted meat, and actual wine under a silk tent. You, on the other hand, are licking crumbs off your gauntlet and trying to convince yourself that hunger builds character. It doesn't. It just builds misery. So forget visions of feasts before battle. Your rations are barely rations. They're a cruel reminder that even if the enemy doesn't take you out, indigestion probably will. You've somehow dodged arrows, outlasted mud, and even resisted the weevil-infested bread. For one glorious moment you think you're going to make it. Then the enemy surrounds you, your weapon is knocked from your hand, and you realise you're not going to die dramatically in the mud after all. You're about to be captured, which is somehow worse. If you're a noble, there's a slim chance things go okay. You might be held for ransom, which means your wealthy family coughs up enough gold to buy you back. You'll spend a few months as an unwilling guest, probably eating better food than your men ever had, before being sent home with a slightly bruised ego. Not great, but survivable. But you're not a noble, are you? You're just you. And that means no ransom, no comfy prison tent, no friendly negotiations. For the average foot soldier, capture was basically the medieval version of, you lost the game and now the DLC is suffering. Best case scenario, you're enslaved. That's right. Congratulations, you now belong to someone else. Hope you enjoy a lifetime of farm labour in a country that doesn't even speak your language. Worst case scenario, the enemy finds you inconvenient. Feeding prisoners costs money after all. And armies didn't like spending money on anything except more pointy objects. Even if you're not executed outright, the humiliation alone is crushing. Stripped of your armour, shoved in with a group of equally miserable men, you realise you're not a proud warrior. You're cargo. And every soldier who walks past reminds you with a smirk. Then there's the psychological torture. You have no idea if you'll ever see home again. Maybe you'll be traded, maybe you'll rot in a makeshift cell. Maybe tomorrow someone decides they're bored, and you're the entertainment. Medieval law didn't exactly include a prisoner's rights handbook. At least death on the battlefield was quick if messy. Capture? That's slow, drawn out, and filled with uncertainty. Every day is another reminder that you were important enough to survive, but not important enough to matter. So yes, you thought surrender was the safe option. Instead, you just signed up for the medieval loyalty program, where the reward for survival is misery, drudgery, and maybe, if you're lucky, an escape story no one believes. You've made it farther than anyone expected. The arrows missed, the horses trampled someone else, and you even managed to survive Steve's accidental spear poke. For a brief, shining moment, you imagine this might all end with a ballad sung about you in a tavern. Then reality sets in. Your glorious end is going to be anything but glorious. First, let's talk about surrender. You think that if you drop your weapon, raise your hands, and look suitably pitiful, the enemy will take you in. That's adorable. The truth is, no one has time for prisoners when the field is full of chaos. If you're lucky, you're ignored. If you're unlucky, you're dealt with by someone who doesn't feel like babysitting. Medieval mercy was inconsistent, at best. Okay, so maybe you're imagining a heroic duel. the noble knight facing a worthy opponent, blades clashing until one falls. That's cute too. On real battlefields, no one wastes time on honourable showdowns. Your end is more likely a messy pile-up, with 3 different weapons hitting you from 3 different directions. The chroniclers never write about that part, or maybe you're thinking, at least my commander will notice me. Sorry, he won't. He's already galloping away to safety, leaving you to become a cautionary tale about why you shouldn't have trusted the banners. The truth is, nobody cares about your personal bravery. Armies don't remember individuals, they remember numbers, and you're just one of them. The best case, glorious ending? Someone might strip you of your armour and tell a story later about how they bested a soldier of the enemy. Congratulations, you've been downgraded from person to anecdote. Worst case, you're buried in a mass pit, nameless and forgotten, while chroniclers write poems about how noble the lords were. And let's be honest, even if you did die in a technically impressive way, no one back home will ever hear the details. Your mother will get the short version, he fought bravely, which really translates to, we don't know what happened, probably mud. So much for the glorious end. Instead of being remembered as a legend, you're remembered as that guy who didn't come back. The real glory goes to the storytellers, not the ones lying in the field. So here you are, you've sweated, stumbled, dodged arrows, eaten questionable bread, and stared down war horses. You've survived panic, mud, and even Steve's clumsy friendly fire. You've made it to the end. Surely all this suffering will count for something. Surely your name will echo through history. Not quite. In the Middle Ages, unless you were a noble, a commander, or someone who married into a very complicated family tree, your legacy boiled down to nothing. Chroniclers didn't waste ink on common soldiers. They wrote about kings, dukes, and the occasional dramatic noble who tripped over his own lance. You, the anonymous foot soldier, simply became part of the body count. At best, you're the army lost 3,000 men. Congrats, you're one of the 3,000. And let's say you did something impressive. Maybe you held the line for a few extra minutes, or you actually managed to knock a knight off his horse. Does that get you remembered? Nope. The glory gets credited to your lord, who was probably sitting on a hill strategizing while you did the actual work. Back home, your family might remember you for a while, but even then, it's not as a hero. It's as the one who didn't come back, which is less epic and more depressing. Villagers will nod solemnly for a few weeks before moving on with their lives, because survival doesn't stop to honour the fallen. Meanwhile, songs and poems about the battle focus entirely on the nobility. The peasants who fought, bled, and froze in the mud, they're stage props. Nobody sings about you, nobody carves your name on a monument. Your armour gets looted, your body goes into a pit, and history forgets you existed. And if you think your spirit will live on in tales told at taverns, think again. The only stories people love are about outlaws, kings, or saints who did something flashy. You're just some guy who went off to war. That's the ultimate medieval battlefield truth. It didn't matter how brave you were, how long you lasted, or how miserable your final moments were. Your legacy was silence. You dreamed of glory. History gave you anonymity. For a medieval peasant, the garden wasn't just a patch of green outside the hut. It was the thin line between hunger and survival. Unlike the ornamental courtyards of nobles, or the vast estates managed by monasteries, the peasant's garden was a scrappy, stubborn little piece of earth, carved out of necessity. Every square foot mattered. Every seed had a purpose. There was no room for luxury here, only life, sustenance, and the hope of making it through the seasons. It was often the women of the household who carried the secrets of this little Eden. From mother to daughter, from grandmother to granddaughter, knowledge flowed like an invisible inheritance. Which herbs eased stomach cramps, which roots could fight fever, and which bitter leaves might save a sick cow. These were not written in books, for books belonged to the clergy. Instead, this wisdom lived in memory, in calloused hands, and in quiet rituals repeated with the turn of the moon. The peasant garden was a miracle of efficiency. In one cramped corner you'd find onions huddled near carrots, an early form of companion planting. The sharp scent of the onion kept away pests that would have chewed through the carrots. A row of beans might climb their way up wooden sticks, while peas shared the soil beneath, enriching it with nutrients that would keep it fertile for the next round of planting. Nothing was planted at random. Every pairing had a logic that today we'd call organic farming, but for them it was simply survival strategy. Even the waste of the household found its way back into the earth. Animal dung, kitchen scraps, and rotting straw were gathered into smelly piles, slowly turning into the compost that breathed new life into tired soil. It was dirty, hard work, but it meant the difference between a harvest and an empty table, and above all, the garden was timed by the heavens. Peasants didn't have clocks, but they had the phases of the moon. Seeds might be sown during a waxing moon, when the growing light promised strong shoots, or harvested when the moon waned, believed to bring better storage. These rhythms bound the peasants to cycles far larger than themselves, aligning their survival with the turning sky. For these families, the garden was not just food. It was medicine, security, and tradition. A lifeline dug into the soil, feeding not just the body, but the resilience of a people who had no other safety net. If the medieval garden was the family's lifeline, then the women were its guardians. While men were often away in the fields, tending sheep or sweating under the Lord's plough, it was women who bent over the small family plot, sleeves rolled up, hands deep in the soil. They knew when to plant, when to harvest, and when to cut herbs at dawn while the dew still clung to their leaves, said to give them greater strength. Much of this knowledge was practical. What healed wounds, what calmed coughs, what kept fleas off a baby's cradle, but it was also wrapped in ritual and tradition. Some women whispered charms while planting seeds, not because they expected magic to sprout, but because such words made them feel aligned with the earth and heavens. Others swore that basil only thrived if planted with a smile, or that rue cut on a Friday warded off evil spirits. To an outsider it might have looked like superstition, but to the peasant it was simply the wisdom of ancestors layered with centuries of trial and error. The garden was also a place of experimentation. Women tried out combinations, moving crops around each year to see which patch of soil responded best. They noticed that leeks grew sturdier when placed where beans had been the year before, or that cabbage attracted fewer worms when ringed with sage. These were not accidents. They were observations turned into strategies, a slow science carried out without notebooks or laboratories. Children, too, were part of this cycle of knowledge. Little hands fetched water, plucked weeds, or chased chickens away from the herbs. While helping, they absorbed lessons without even realizing it. Which root to pull for a fever, which leaf to chew to dull hunger pains, and which plants could kill if mistaken for food. By the time a girl reached adulthood, she carried a library of knowledge in her memory, one that might never be written, but would save her family countless times over. This expertise gave women a quiet but undeniable power. In a society where peasants had little control over taxes, laws, or even their own fates, the garden was one domain where women reigned supreme. Their judgment could decide whether the household would endure a hard winter or crumble under sickness and scarcity. And so, while history books often overlooked them, these peasant women were the hidden pharmacists, farmers, and guardians of medieval survival. One of the cleverest tricks medieval peasants used, though they wouldn't have called it agriculture science, was the practice we now call companion planting. To a peasant, this wasn't theory. It was pattern recognition, born from centuries of watching what grew well together and what stubbornly refused to share soil. If carrots thrived when planted beside onions, you didn't argue. You planted more carrots beside more onions. Take the classic onion and carrot partnership. The onion's strong smell masked the scent of carrots, confusing the dreaded carrot fly that could otherwise devastate a row. Meanwhile, the carrot's delicate foliage didn't compete with the onion's spiky leaves, so they grew harmoniously without stealing light or space. Peasants might not have explained it in terms of pest deterrence and non-competing root systems, but they saw the results in fuller baskets at harvest. Then there were the legumes, beans and peas. These humble plants carried a secret weapon in their roots, the ability to enrich the soil itself. Peasants may not have known the word nitrogen, but they knew that after beans grew in a patch, other crops planted there seemed stronger. So beans and peas were often cycled through the garden, acting as invisible fertilizer factories, keeping the soil lively rather than exhausted. Herbs, too, had their roles. Dill might be tucked in between rows of cabbage to lure away pests, while sage and thyme acted like little green shields, warding off insects and flavouring the stew pot later. Some plants even served as sacrificial victims. Nasturtiums, for instance, drew hungry insects away from vegetables. To the peasant eye, This meant that while the nasturtiums looked ragged and chewed, the cabbages beside them stayed crisp and whole, a worthy trade. What's striking is how peasants wove together food, medicine, and protection in one tiny patch of earth. Every plant was part of a larger strategy. Even flowers weren't purely decorative. Marigolds could brighten the garden, while discouraging pests and soothing skin when brewed into a salve. Nothing was wasted, not even beauty. Through this web of partnerships, the medieval peasant garden became more than the sum of its parts. It was an ecosystem, carefully balanced through observation and experience. By planting with purpose, peasants tricked nature into working for them, turning a bare strip of land into a self-sustaining engine of survival. If the medieval peasant garden had a secret ingredient, it wasn't some rare herb or forgotten spellbook. It was manure. Yes, plain, smelly, unavoidable dung. Cows, sheep, pigs, chickens, whatever the household had, their waste was just as valuable as their milk, wool, or eggs. To the modern mind, it might sound unglamorous, but in a world without chemical fertilizers, animal waste was liquid gold, or more accurately, steaming brown gold. The process was simple, though hardly pleasant. Manure was collected and heaped together with kitchen scraps, old straw, and whatever organic matter could be spared. Over time, this unsightly mountain transformed. Heat built up inside the pile, worms wriggled through it, and slowly, rot worked its alchemy. Weeks or months later, what had once been a revolting heap became rich, crumbly compost, dark earth that smelled less like dung and more like life. Peasants noticed the difference immediately. Where compost was spread, the soil stayed looser, crops grew taller, and harvests looked far more promising. Without it, the land turned stubborn, hard, and less generous year after year. Composting, though not given a fancy name, was a cornerstone of survival. There was even a rhythm to its use. Manure from different animals had different reputations. Cow dung was prized for being steady and reliable, pig manure for being potent, and sometimes too strong if not aged properly, while chicken droppings were considered the fiery stuff, almost too hot to spread fresh without burning the plants. Every peasant learned this through trial, error, and probably a few tragic carrot patches sacrificed along the way. The recycling didn't stop there. Nothing organic was wasted. Potato peels, cabbage stalks, even the bones from a stew might be tossed into the compost heap, broken down over time into nutrients. It was a cycle that kept the garden alive. Animals fed the family, their waste fed the soil fed the plants, and the plants fed both animals and people again. In a strange way, the compost heap was the medieval peasant's version of modern recycling. It turned garbage into hope, filth into food. And while no one wrote poems about it, every family who survived the winter owed their thanks to the humble, stinking miracle of manure. For medieval peasants, the sky was more than a backdrop of stars. It was a clock, a calendar, and sometimes even a whispering guide. Without printed almanacs in every home, peasants turned to the most reliable timekeeper they had, the moon. Its waxing and waning glow became a kind of farming manual, believed to influence the pull of growth in plants, just as it stirred the tides of the sea. Seeds were never scattered carelessly. A waxing moon, swelling toward fullness, was thought to draw sap upward, encouraging strong shoots and leafy growth. This was the time for crops that grew above the ground: peas, beans, lettuce, herbs. The light of the fattening moon promised vigour, so women saved their best seeds for these nights, slipping them into soil as silver light spilled across the fields. When the moon began to wane, shrinking toward darkness, its pull was believed to sink deep into the earth. That was the season for root crops: onions, carrots, turnips, vegetables that needed to bury themselves in the soil to thrive. To sow them under a waxing moon would be courting disappointment. To plant them under the waning one was to align with nature's hidden currents. Even harvesting and preserving were timed with the sky. Herbs meant for medicine were best gathered at dawn with dew still on their leaves, preferably under a waxing moon when their strength was thought to be fullest. Grain for storage was ideally cut when the moon waned, its pull said to keep rot and pests at bay. These practices weren't idle superstition. For a family with no surplus, even small improvements meant survival. Of course, not every peasant gazed up at the stars philosophically. Some grumbled about the timing, muttering that the moon's pull didn't matter nearly as much as the weather or the Lord's tax collector. Yet, over generations, enough successes aligned with lunar planting that the tradition endured. To ignore it felt reckless, almost like insulting a power far greater than oneself. Thus, each garden was not only rooted in soil, but also tethered to the sky. Medieval peasants might have been bound to the land, but their gaze remained upward, measuring their fortunes by the glowing arc of the moon. For medieval peasants, the garden was more than a source of food. It was the family pharmacy. When illness struck, there was no rushing to a doctor. Physicians were rare, costly, and often reserved for lords, monasteries, or wealthy townsfolk. For everyone else, healing came in the form of leaves, roots, and flowers carefully tended just outside the door. Every peasant woman carried a mental list of cures. Chamomile soothed aching stomachs and restless sleep. Yarrow, with its feathery leaves, was prized for staunching wounds and helping fevers break. Garlic wasn't just for flavouring broth. It was crushed and eaten as a ward against coughs and infection. If a child had worms, wormwood lived up to its name. If a man had aches from the fields, comfrey could be mashed into a poultice to ease the swelling. The line between food and medicine was often blurred. Parsley brightened a dish, but also helped digestion. Cabbage leaves could be eaten in stews or pressed against a sore joint. Even the humblest onion was seen as a cure-all, eaten raw for colds, boiled for coughs, and applied to wounds as a crude antiseptic. To the medieval mind, nature had stocked the garden with answers for nearly every ailment, if one only knew where to look. Of course, some cures were as much ritual as remedy. Herbs were gathered at dawn, sometimes with a whispered prayer, for it was believed the morning dew carried strength. Certain plants were cut only with a clean blade, others only under a waxing moon. A pinch of superstition clung to almost every remedy. Did it always work? Perhaps not. But when the choice was between trying a handful of sage or doing nothing at all, peasants put their faith in the green world. The garden also provided remedies for livestock, an essential lifeline, since a sick cow or lame ox could spell disaster. Nettles were fed to improve milk, garlic given to chickens to keep them healthy, and bitter herbs mixed into fodder to fight parasites. The same patch of earth that kept people alive also safeguarded their animals. In short, the medieval garden wasn't just about calories. It was about resilience. Every herb growing there carried the memory of past sicknesses survived, lessons learned, and knowledge handed down. For peasants, these plants were both lifeline and legacy. The medieval peasant garden was never static. It pulsed with the rhythm of the seasons. To survive, families had to think months ahead, planning not just for today's meal, but for next winter's survival. Each season carried its own tasks, rituals, and risks. Spring was the season of hope and back-breaking labour. As the frost retreated, women and children turned the soil, breaking clods with wooden tools and spreading precious manure from the heap. Seeds for peas, onions, and lettuce were tucked into the warming earth. This was a time of nerves and prayers, for a late frost or too much rain could undo weeks of effort in a single night. Families sowed not just crops, but also their fortunes for the year. Summer brought growth, but also vigilance. Gardens were weeded constantly, for weeds were relentless rivals. Children were dispatched to scare off birds or chase chickens away from tender shoots. Herbs were cut in midsummer, when their oils were said to be strongest, and some plants, like dill or fennel, were dried and stored for both flavour and medicine. Summer was a balance of reaping enough for daily meals while carefully saving the best for the leaner months to come. Autumn was harvest season, the moment of truth. Carrots and turnips were pulled from the ground and packed into cellars or pits lined with straw. Cabbages were hung upside down or salted into barrels. Beans and peas were dried for winter stews, while onions and garlic were braided into long ropes to be hung in smoky kitchens. Families measured their survival in baskets and bundles, hoping their stores would last until spring returned. Winter was the long test. Gardens fell silent, buried in frost, yet the work continued indoors. Herbs dried in summer were brewed into teas for fevers. Stored roots were rationed carefully, stretched to last until the earth softened again. Some families even sprouted beans inside clay pots near the fire for a touch of fresh green when the snow seemed endless. This cycle was relentless, repeated year after year. To miss a season, to plant too late, or to misjudge the harvest could mean hunger. But when the rhythm was kept, the peasant garden became more than a patch of earth. It became a compass, guiding families through the harsh turning of the medieval year. Though each peasant family kept its own small patch of soil, no garden existed in isolation. Villages were woven together by necessity, and the sharing of seeds, cuttings, and hard-earned advice was as much a part of survival as the planting itself. One household might guard a particularly hardy strain of bean, while another kept a lineage of onions that stored longer through the winter. Over time, these exchanges created a living library of plants, passed hand to hand like heirlooms. Women were often the centre of this quiet commerce. When neighbours gathered at the well or churchyard, gossip might be laced with gardening secrets. How to keep slugs off lettuce, which root patch had thrived despite drought, or which herb had healed a stubborn cough. Knowledge wasn't hoarded, it was traded, woven into the fabric of community life. The loss of a crop in one household could sometimes be offset by generosity from another, for all knew that next year the roles might be reversed. Gardens also tied peasants to the larger web of tradition. Feasts and festivals often began in the soil. Garlic and leeks flavoured stews shared at midsummer gatherings. Herbs like sage and thyme seasoned communal bread. Even small celebrations, like a wedding or christening, drew upon the fruits of many gardens, stitched together in a shared meal that bound neighbours as tightly as kinship did. Yet community could also spark quiet competition. Who had the earliest peas? Who managed to store cabbages without rot? Who brewed the strongest nettle beer or the most soothing chamomile tea? Pride slipped between rows of beans just as surely as weeds did. And a well-kept garden was a mark of diligence, even status, among peasants who had little else to boast about. Still, in hard years, when blight, pests, or weather threatened the harvest, gardens became lifelines not just for families, but for entire villages. Shared seed stock ensured survival, and collective knowledge helped rebuild what had been lost. These little plots of soil were not merely private endeavours, they were threads in a larger tapestry of survival. In the end, the medieval peasant's garden wasn't only a source of food and medicine. It was also a bond between neighbours, a symbol of resilience, and a reminder that in a world of uncertainty, survival was always a communal act. The medieval peasant garden was small, often no more than a fenced patch pressed close to the family's hut, yet within its boundaries lay the heartbeat of survival. These gardens never dazzled with beauty the way noble estates did, nor did they carry the scholarly prestige of monastery orchards. But for the peasant family, their humble garden was more precious than gold. It fed, healed, and sustained them through the endless cycle of work and uncertainty. Each row of onions or beans was a thread in a web of resilience. Companion planting kept pests at bay without the need for powders or potions. Compost heaps transformed waste into life. The moon's phases, red in the night sky, guided the timing of sowing and harvesting, and herbs doubled as medicine, standing in for doctors peasants could rarely afford. All these tricks stitched together survival strategies, learned not in schools but in soil, carried in memory, and guarded in tradition. What makes these gardens remarkable is not only their practicality, but their legacy. The methods peasants relied on, companion planting, natural composting, herbal medicine, echo in today's conversations about sustainability and organic farming. What we now call eco-conscious living was for them simply life. Their survival instincts became an unbroken chain, passed through centuries, shaping practices still alive in rural villages across Europe. And yet, beyond the practicality, these gardens offered something deeper, a sense of control in a world where peasants had very little. Taxes, weather, war, famine. These were forces beyond their grasp. But in their gardens, with their own hands, peasants could carve out a measure of security. A row of leeks meant fewer hungry nights. A pot of sage tea meant hope against fever. Even a single sprig of thyme drying in the rafters was a quiet act of defiance against the fragility of life. The medieval garden, then, was more than earth and plants. It was memory and resilience, a partnership between people and the natural world. In its tangled rows and compost heaps, peasants built not just food for the body, but a legacy of endurance, proof that even in the harshest conditions, human ingenuity can bloom from the soil. Spartacus was not the kind of man Rome expected to fear. He began not as a king or general, but as a soldier, who, after deserting the Roman legions, found himself captured and sold into slavery. His fate seemed sealed when he was sent to the gladiatorial school at Capua, a grim training ground where men were broken, reshaped, and thrown into the arena to fight for the amusement of roaring crowds. To most Romans, Gladiators were little more than tools, entertainment wrapped in muscle, destined to bleed for sport. But Spartacus was different. Accounts suggest he was Thracian, a man from the rugged lands north of Greece, and he carried the toughness of his homeland with him. He endured the brutal drills, the weapons practice, the endless punishment that turned men into living spectacles. Yet under the surface, he was quietly watching, learning, and waiting. The arena might have been Rome's theatre of death, but Spartacus was already imagining something else, a chance to turn his chains into weapons. In 73 BCE, the opportunity came. Alongside about 70 fellow gladiators, Spartacus planned an escape. Armed at first with little more than kitchen knives and skewers stolen from the kitchens, they burst out of the school, overpowering guards, and seized proper weapons as they went. It was a desperate gamble, the kind that usually ended with crucifixions along the road. Instead, it sparked the beginning of something Rome had not anticipated, a full-scale revolt. Once free, Spartacus proved himself not just brave, but cunning. He led the escapees into the countryside, raiding for supplies and gathering others to his cause. Runaway slaves, shepherds, and labourers flocked to his banner. What began as a ragged band of gladiators grew into a swelling force of men and women who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. For Rome, it was an insult of the highest order. Slaves were supposed to fear their masters, not take up arms against them. Yet here was Spartacus, a former gladiator, turning humiliation into defiance. He was no longer just a man fighting for his own freedom. He was the spark of a rebellion that would soon terrify the mightiest empire of the Mediterranean. When Spartacus and his fellow gladiators first slipped into the hills, the Roman authorities barely noticed. To them, this was a nuisance, a handful of runaway slaves who would be hunted down in short order. But Rome had underestimated what desperation could achieve. What began as 70 men quickly swelled into hundreds, then thousands. Every runaway slave, shepherd, and field hand who heard the whispers of rebellion had a choice: remain in chains or take a gamble on freedom. For many, the decision was easy. The countryside became Spartacus's recruiting ground. He welcomed men who had known nothing but the lash, women who had been sold and resold, even entire families who slipped away under the cover of darkness. Within months, his army was no longer a gang of fugitives, but a swelling community bound by rage and hope. Estimates vary, but ancient sources suggest that at its peak, his following may have reached 70,000 men and women. It was an astonishing number, enough to shake the very foundations of Roman control. Spartacus himself showed a gift for leadership that surprised everyone. He trained his followers with discipline, teaching them to fight in formation rather than as scattered mobs. He organized supply raids with precision, ensuring the rebels were not simply surviving but thriving. Weapons were taken from defeated Roman soldiers, while blacksmiths among the slaves reforged farming tools into spears and swords. The camp became a rough reflection of a society. Fighters, cooks, healers, scouts, and families all bound together by the dream of liberty. Rome, still dismissive, sent poorly trained militia to put the revolt down. To their shock, Spartacus smashed them. His forces ambushed Roman patrols, struck at supply lines, and melted back into the hills before organized counterattacks could land. Each victory brought more recruits, more weapons, and more confidence. For the first time, slaves across Italy dared to imagine the impossible, that Rome itself could be beaten. What frightened the Senate most was not just Spartacus's victories, but the symbolism of them. A gladiator, someone trained for amusement, was now defeating Rome's soldiers. The social order that kept millions in chains was suddenly wobbling. The rebellion was no longer a mere escape attempt. It was a movement. At first, the Roman Senate treated Spartacus as a minor irritation, a blemish on their pride rather than a genuine threat. Gladiators, after all, were trained killers, but still slaves. Surely a few militia would crush them like flies. But as news spread of Roman patrols cut down, towns raided, and entire regions slipping into panic, Rome realized this was no ordinary revolt. Spartacus's victories had become an embarrassment. Worse, they were an inspiration to other slaves across Italy. In 73 BCE, the Senate dispatched a praetor, Gaius Claudius Glaber, with a proper force to deal with the uprising. His orders were simple: surround Spartacus and starve him into submission. Glaber marched his men to block the rebels on Mount Vesuvius, confident that hunger would do his work for him. But Spartacus had no intention of waiting quietly to die. Using ropes woven from vines, he and his men scaled down the steep side of the mountain, surprising the Romans from behind. In a brutal clash, Glaber's forces were routed, their camp overrun, their supplies seized. The Senate's first real attempt to crush Spartacus ended in humiliation. This defeat sent shockwaves through Rome. It was one thing for militia to be beaten, quite another for a praetor and his legions to be outsmarted by slaves. A second praetor was dispatched, Verinius, but he too suffered defeats, his soldiers scattered and his camp captured. Each Roman failure added fuel to the rebellion, drawing more men and women to Spartacus's cause. By now, the revolt could no longer be dismissed as a minor uprising. Spartacus commanded tens of thousands, moving through the Italian countryside with both cunning and ferocity. He was not seeking random chaos. His strategy was to march north, escape Italy, and lead his people back to their homelands beyond Roman control. Freedom, not conquest, seemed his goal. Yet freedom for slaves meant humiliation for Rome. To allow Spartacus to succeed would undermine the very foundation of Roman society, built on the labour of millions in bondage. The Senate could no longer afford half measures. The rebellion had grown into a war, and Rome would have to treat it as such. The time of dismissing Spartacus was over. With the praetors humiliated, Spartacus suddenly found himself the master of an army Rome had failed to contain. What had started as 70 men armed with kitchen knives was now a swelling host, tens of thousands strong, hardened by desperation and inspired by victory. These were not polished legions, but men and women who had escaped chains and tasted triumph. That taste was intoxicating. Spartacus's plan, at least in the beginning, was straightforward. Escape Italy. He knew Rome would never forgive a slave revolt, and every victory only made the Senate more determined to destroy him. The Alps lay to the north, beyond which freedom beckoned. If his people could break through, they might scatter back to Gaul, Thrace, and beyond, slipping forever from Rome's grasp. It was a bold vision. Tens of thousands of slaves marching like a migrating nation, carrying their families, their hopes, and their vengeance toward the mountains. The march north was anything but simple. The rebels clashed with multiple Roman forces sent to intercept them, and each time, Spartacus proved himself a strategist of rare talent. He divided his forces when needed, used ambushes in rugged terrain, and struck quickly at isolated detachments before they could regroup. Roman commanders who expected disorganized mobs instead found themselves fighting disciplined formations, led by a man who understood both cunning and courage. Ancient sources describe the shock in Rome as entire legions faltered before a gladiator's army. Spartacus defeated consular forces, humiliating men who had once held the highest offices in the Republic. Camps were captured, standards seized, and supplies redistributed to his followers. With every clash, his reputation grew, and so did the fear that gripped the Senate. Yet even within the rebel ranks, there were divisions. Not everyone shared Spartacus's vision of escape. Some, led by fellow gladiators like Crixus, wanted to stay in Italy, plunder, and revel in their newfound power. These disagreements would eventually weaken the movement. For now, though, victory after victory fueled momentum, and Spartacus pressed northward. By 72 BCE, he had reached the edge of Italy, the towering Alps in sight. Freedom was within reach, but fate, and perhaps the lure of vengeance, would soon turn him back toward the heart of the empire he sought to escape. By 72 BCE, Spartacus stood on the edge of triumph. The Alps loomed ahead, cold and unyielding, but beyond them lay freedom. For the first time, it seemed possible that tens of thousands of former slaves might slip through Rome's grasp, scattering to their homelands and vanishing beyond the reach of Roman law. Yet in that crucial moment, the rebellion faltered, not from Roman steel, but from the choices within Spartacus's own camp. Spartacus wanted to press forward, to climb the mountains and lead his people away from Italy forever. But his army was not made of Thracians alone. Among them were Gauls, Germans, shepherds, farmers, and countless men who had known nothing but bondage in Roman soil. Some argued that Rome itself, with its fat estates and sprawling cities, should be plundered. Others, like the gladiator Crixus, saw no reason to flee when they could enjoy power where they stood. To men who had lived under the lash, the thought of turning their backs on vengeance seemed unbearable. Crixus and his followers eventually broke away, choosing to stay in Italy and raid the countryside. Spartacus continued north with the larger force, but the split was a dangerous omen. When Roman legions caught Crixus and his men, they were slaughtered, tens of thousands cut down in a single confrontation. Rome celebrated, but Spartacus did not. Sources claim he forced captured Romans to fight in mock gladiatorial games, sacrificing them in honour of his fallen comrades. A grim reminder that this was no ordinary war, but one born of slavery and rage. Then came Spartacus's fateful turn. Instead of pushing through the Alps to freedom, he led his army back south, deeper into Italy. The reasons remain debated. Some say his followers refused to leave, demanding vengeance and plunder. Others suggest Spartacus himself saw an opportunity to strike at Rome directly, perhaps even dreaming of toppling the Republic. Whatever his motive, the march south marked a turning point. The chance for escape slipped away, and with it, the best hope for lasting freedom. The rebellion was no longer simply a flight from slavery. It was becoming a struggle for dominance within Italy itself, a war Rome could not ignore, and one that Spartacus could not easily win. By 72 BCE, Rome had suffered humiliation after humiliation at the hands of Spartacus. Praetors had failed, consuls had been beaten, and legions had been routed by a force that, in the Senate's eyes, should never have existed. Rome needed a solution, and it found one in Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in the Republic. Crassus was ambitious, ruthless, and eager to turn a slave war into a stepping stone for his political career. Unlike earlier commanders, Crassus treated the rebellion as a true war. He raised 6 new legions in addition to the remnants of those already bloodied in battle, giving him perhaps 40,000 men. But numbers alone would not guarantee victory. Crassus knew that Rome's recent failures were due in part to poor discipline. His solution was as brutal as it was effective. He revived the ancient punishment of decimation. When one of his legions broke in the face of Spartacus's forces, Crassus ordered every 10th man executed by his comrades. It was a savage punishment designed to strike terror into the hearts of soldiers, and it worked. Fear of Spartacus was replaced by fear of their own commander. Crassus had reforged the Roman legions into a machine of discipline and obedience, ready to grind down the rebellion. Meanwhile, Spartacus and his army continued to move south, plundering estates and defeating detachments. But cracks were showing. Supplies grew harder to secure, factions within the camp argued, and the dream of unity was fraying. Some sources suggest Spartacus even tried to negotiate passage to Sicily, hoping to continue the fight with the help of rebellious slaves there. But the plan faltered, perhaps betrayed by pirates who promised ships and delivered nothing. The rebels remained trapped in Italy, hemmed in by Rome's tightening grip. Crassus began his campaign with caution, fortifying his positions and cutting off Spartacus's mobility. He built massive defensive works across the toe of Italy, walls and trenches stretching for miles, aiming to pen the rebels in and starve them out. It was a war of attrition now, and Rome had the resources to play the long game. For Spartacus, the tide was turning. He was still a brilliant leader, still capable of victories, but for the first time, Rome had an opponent as relentless as himself. The final act of the rebellion was about to begin. Crassus was no fool. Unlike the praetors and consuls who had underestimated Spartacus, he knew brute force alone would not be enough. His massive fortifications in southern Italy were designed to suffocate the rebellion. Trenches, walls, and ditches stretched across the land, hemming the rebels into the tip of the peninsula. It was a bold strategy: starve Spartacus's army until desperation forced surrender. But Spartacus was not a man who accepted cages lightly. Faced with dwindling supplies and growing restlessness among his tens of thousands, he devised a daring escape. According to ancient sources, the rebels filled Crassus's trenches with earth, brush, and even the bodies of captured animals, creating passages through which they could break free. Under cover of night, they surged across the barriers, clashing with Roman guards and forcing their way out. It was a brutal gamble, but it worked. The rebellion, bloodied but unbroken, slipped from Crassus's trap. Once free, Spartacus sought to reignite momentum. He struck at Roman detachments, captured supplies, and tried to rally his followers with visions of escape or renewed conquest. Yet the strain was showing. Not all his men remained loyal. Desertions chipped away at his numbers, and the constant hunger for food and weapons gnawed at morale. The grand dream of freedom across the Alps was a fading memory. Now, every battle was a fight for survival. Crassus pursued relentlessly, determined to restore Roman honor. He offered no mercy and took no risks, driving Spartacus into increasingly desperate positions. Still, the gladiator's cunning had not deserted him. In several engagements, his forces inflicted heavy casualties, proving that even cornered Spartacus remained a commander to be feared, but time was against him. The Senate, nervous that Crassus alone might gain the glory of victory, recalled Pompey the Great from Spain to aid in crushing the rebellion. Pompey's legions were marching south, promising to close the jaws of the trap once and for all. Spartacus knew the noose was tightening. If he was to find freedom, or at least dignity, he would have to make a final decisive stand. The stage was set for the last clash, a battle that would decide not just Spartacus's fate, but the message Rome would send to every slave who ever dreamed of freedom. In 71 BCE, Spartacus faced the end of the road. Trapped between Crassus's disciplined legions in the south and Pompey's army marching from the north, he had little room left to maneuver. The Alps were long behind him, Sicily was unreachable, and his once massive army had dwindled, worn down by battle, hunger, and desertion. Yet, Spartacus refused to vanish quietly. If Rome demanded blood, he would give them a river of it before he fell. According to Plutarch, before the final battle, Spartacus killed his own horse, declaring that if he won, he would have his pick of Roman mounts, and if he lost, he would have no need of one. It was a gesture that spoke of defiance, but also of grim acceptance. This was not a march to freedom anymore. It was a march to destiny. The battlefield was brutal. Spartacus hurled his men against Crassus's legions, determined to break through and strike at the heart of Roman power one last time. For hours, the rebels fought with a desperation that shocked even hardened soldiers. Armed with weapons scavenged from years of victories, they crashed against Rome's shields in wave after wave. The ground became a chaos of dust, iron, and cries. Spartacus himself fought at the front, not directing from safety, but carving a path with his sword. Ancient accounts describe him cutting down 2 centurions and fighting his way toward Crassus himself, as if determined to end the war in single combat. He was wounded, yet he fought on, surrounded by his comrades. Eventually, pressed on all sides, Spartacus fell, not crawling, not begging, but standing, sword still in hand. His body was never recovered, swallowed in the carnage of his final stand. The rebellion ended that day. Tens of thousands of slaves lay dead, and the survivors, those unlucky enough to be captured, were shown no mercy. Crassus ordered 6,000 of them crucified along the Appian Way, lining the road from Capua to Rome with bodies as a warning. Travellers would pass those crosses for years, a grim reminder of what awaited anyone who dared defy the Republic. Spartacus's dream of freedom died with him, but his legend had only just begun. The rebellion of Spartacus ended in blood, but its memory refused to die. For Rome, the revolt was both a humiliation and a lesson. The Republic had survived, but only after expending vast resources and suffering repeated defeats at the hands of men it considered beneath contempt. Spartacus had shaken the confidence of the Senate, reminding Rome that the foundation of its power, millions of slaves, could also become its greatest weakness. Official Roman histories portrayed him as a dangerous criminal, a man who threatened the social order. Yet even hostile sources could not hide a grudging respect. Plutarch described Spartacus as intelligent, courageous, and a leader of remarkable ability. For a Thracian gladiator, he achieved what few generals could, defeating consuls, routing legions, and keeping an army alive for nearly 2 years against the might of the Republic. His failure was inevitable, but his defiance was unforgettable. The crucifixions along the Appian Way were meant to silence rebellion forever. But the sight of 6,000 broken bodies may also have fueled the legend. Those who passed along that road saw not just punishment, but a warning of how close Rome had come to disaster. The rebellion haunted the Republic, making elites wary of any hint of unrest among the enslaved masses. In some ways, Spartacus had already achieved what he wanted. He made Rome afraid. Centuries later, his name would be reimagined, transformed from rebel to symbol. To revolutionaries, he became a hero of freedom, a man who dared to rise against impossible odds. To storytellers, his tale became one of courage, sacrifice, and the dream of breaking chains. Even today, Spartacus is remembered less as a defeated slave and more as a defiant figure who challenged an empire. His rebellion did not end slavery, nor did it topple Rome. Yet it carved a place in history far larger than its outcome. Spartacus embodied the universal struggle for freedom, the willingness to fight, even in the face of certain death, rather than accept a life of bondage. In that sense, his legacy endures. Rome crushed his body, but it could not erase the idea he carried, that even the lowest could rise against the mighty, and for a fleeting moment, make the empire tremble. The symposium did not begin with wine, it began with arrival. To be invited was already a mark of status. Only men of the elite were welcome, along with the occasional philosopher or guest whose cleverness outweighed his birth. The setting was the andron, the men's chamber of a wealthy household. It was a space built for display as much as for comfort, its floors often decorated with intricate mosaics, its walls painted with mythological scenes. This was not a place for farming talk or petty concerns. It was a stage where politics, poetry, and philosophy would unfold over the course of a long, intoxicating night. Guests arrived at dusk, greeted by servants who carried water basins for hand-washing and jars of scented oil to dab on skin and hair. To recline at a symposium was not simply to sit, it was to present oneself. Cloaks were arranged just so, sandals polished, hair oiled and combed. Appearance mattered, for here one would not only drink, but also compete in conversation, wit, and reputation. Inside the andron, couches lined the walls, angled towards small tables set with cups, bowls, and garlands of flowers. Slaves bustled quietly, preparing wine bowls and laying out the first offerings to the gods. Before anything else, a libation was poured, wine spilled in honour of Dionysus, the god of revelry, and often to Zeus or other deities, as if to remind the guests that even excess required divine approval. Once reclined, each man had his place, with the host typically directing the order of the evening. The layout was intimate yet calculated. No one could hide, and each guest was expected to contribute. The symposium was not a feast of food. The main meal was eaten beforehand. Instead, it was a feast of words, ideas, and indulgence. Food, if present, was light. Fruits, nuts, honey cakes. What mattered was the wine, the music, and the company. To step into the andron was to cross a threshold. Outside were the duties of war, politics, and family. Inside was a world suspended, half sacred, half decadent, where the rules of ordinary life bent under the influence of conversation, laughter, and the slow rhythm of diluted wine. It was a night of masks without masks, where truth might surface in jest, and jest might alter truth. The heart of any symposium was wine, but never straight from the jar. To drink undiluted wine was considered barbaric, something Thracians or Scythians might do. Greeks prided themselves on moderation through ritual, and so the first act after libations was mixing. In the centre of the room stood the crater, a great bowl into which wine and water were poured together. Ratios varied, sometimes 3 parts water to 1 part wine, sometimes lighter or stronger depending on the host's mood. But the principle remained the same. Civilized men drank together, not to forget themselves entirely, but to stretch the night with wit and pleasure. Presiding over this delicate balance was the symposiarch, the evening's ruler. He might be elected by the guests or chosen by the host, and his authority was absolute, for as long as the symposium lasted. The symposiarch decided how strong the wine would be mixed, how quickly it would flow, and when cups would be refilled. In theory, he was the guardian of moderation. In practice, he could turn the gathering into either a gentle night of philosophy or a raucous carnival of excess. Slaves moved silently around the room, dipping pitchers into the crater and refilling kylixes, shallow, wide cups that forced a man to drink slowly and carefully. Wine was not only for thirst. It was the medium through which truth and playfulness emerged. In wine truth, said the Greeks, believing that a loosened tongue revealed the inner soul. Yet it was a careful balance. Too much, and conversation collapsed into chaos. Too little, and the spirit of the symposium never stirred. To keep the night alive, wine was often accompanied by games of endurance and skill. Guests might be challenged to drain a cup in a single gulp, or hold steady while tossing dregs in the game of Kottabos. All of this unfolded under the watch of the symposiarch, who was as much conductor as dictator. His choices decided whether the evening produced timeless verses and political schemes, or ended with slurred quarrels and overturned tables. In the Greek imagination, wine was not just drink, but a bridge, between men and gods, between seriousness and laughter. between wisdom and folly. The crater in the centre was both altar and engine, its mixing bowl setting the tempo of the night. Once the wine began to flow, the symposium shifted from ritual to rhythm. Conversation filled the air, but music gave the evening its pulse. The most common sound was the sharp, piercing melody of the aulos, a double-piped flute that could be playful or mournful depending on the mood. It was usually played by hired entertainers, women known simply as flute girls. These were not wives or daughters of the guests, but professional performers, slaves, or courtesans brought in to animate the gathering. Their role was more than background music. They provided spectacle, allure, and sometimes intimacy, moving fluidly between art and seduction. Other instruments joined the chorus. The kithara, a lyre-like stringed instrument beloved by poets, or small drums and rattles to keep rhythm. Guests themselves often took part, reciting poems, singing bawdy songs, or improvising verses on themes thrown at them by others. In a world without recordings or stages, entertainment was immediate and participatory. Each guest was both audience and performer, judged not only by his wit but also by his musical grace. Music was not just diversion. It was believed to shape the soul. Philosophers argued whether certain melodies encouraged courage, restraint, or indulgence. To some, the symposium was a training ground for harmony of character. To others, it was simply an excuse to drown out serious thought with dancing and laughter. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. The flute girls, meanwhile, embodied the symposium's contradictions. They were outsiders, often slaves, yet central to the atmosphere. They might play, sing, pour wine, or slip into more intimate roles as the night deepened. Their presence blurred the line between performance and pleasure, between art and desire. For the elite men reclining on couches, this was part of the charm. The symposium existed precisely in that space where refinement and indulgence collided. As cups refilled and the tempo of the evening rose, music set the tone. A solemn hymn might ease the night into thoughtful debate, while a lively tune could push guests into games, laughter, and playful quarrels. The symposium was never static. Like the wine in the crater, it was mixed, part sacred, part profane, part wisdom, part excess, and the music ensured that balance never stopped shifting. If music and wine set the rhythm of a symposium, conversation provided its soul. Reclining on couches, with cups in hand, guests turned the gathering into a theatre of words. Here, politics could be whispered, poetry recited, and philosophy argued with the same intensity as a duel in the arena. The symposium was not simply a drinking party. It was also a place where ideas were sharpened and reputations made. The topics could range from the profound to the absurd. One guest might recite lines from Homer, sparking a debate about the nature of heroism. Another might propose a riddle or challenge others to compose verses on the spot. Political men used the setting to test arguments, float alliances, or whisper criticisms of rivals under the cover of intoxicated laughter. Philosophers, especially in Athens, turned the symposium into a classroom where wisdom was pursued not through formal lectures, but through playful, probing dialogue. Plato's symposium immortalized this aspect of the tradition. In it, Socrates and his companions, drinking deep into the night, discussed the nature of love. For them, wine loosened the tongue, but also stripped away pretense, revealing truths that might have remained hidden in sober daylight. To speak at a symposium was to gamble. Your wit, your knowledge, your very character were on display before peers who would not hesitate to laugh at weakness or celebrate brilliance. Yet the line between wisdom and folly was thin. As the wine deepened, conversation could slide from lofty debates to bawdy jokes or heated quarrels. A guest too drunk might expose himself to ridicule, his arguments collapsing into slurred nonsense. Moderation, again, was the key. The best symposiasts balanced seriousness with levity, mixing philosophy with humour in the same way the wine was mixed with water. What made symposium conversation so powerful was its intimacy. These were not public speeches or formal assemblies. They were private exchanges among equals, spoken in a room fragrant with incense and resonant with music. Ideas could be tested in a freer way, without the rigid protocols of the agora. And sometimes, amid laughter and excess, truths were uncovered that might reshape a man's life. Or, in the case of philosophers like Plato, echo through centuries. The symposium was thus a paradox, a place of indulgence, but also a forge of thought. In the mingling of wine and words, wisdom and wit were never far apart. As the evening ripened and the wine took hold, the symposium became a playground. Conversation and philosophy gave way to contests that mixed skill, laughter, and sometimes humiliation. These games were not distractions. They were central to the event, a way to test wit, agility, and charm in a setting where reputations were always at stake. The most famous of these diversions was Kotobos. Guests would take the dregs of wine left in their cups, and with a flick of the wrist, hurl the liquid across the room toward a target, perhaps a bronze dish balanced on a stand. The goal was to strike it so that it rang with a satisfying clang. Success was greeted with applause and laughter. Failure often brought mockery. But Kotobos was more than a test of accuracy. Men would dedicate their throws to lovers or muses, claiming victory as a sign of favour from the gods or from desire itself. A well-aimed splash could be both a declaration and a flirtation. Other contests unfolded in verse. Guests challenged one another to recite poetry, compose impromptu lines, or answer riddles on the spot. A clumsy answer earned jeers. A clever rhyme could elevate a man's standing in the eyes of his companions. These contests blurred the line between entertainment and intellectual sparring, a reminder that even in play, the symposium was a stage for performance. Drinking itself often became a game. The symposiarch might command that cups be drained in a single gulp, or that each round grow progressively stronger. To falter was to show weakness. To endure was to display resilience and mastery over the intoxicating power of wine. In some symposia, this competition spiraled into chaos, with songs growing louder, laughter sharper, and bodies slumping on couches in surrender to Dionysus. For all their frivolity, these games carried meaning. They revealed skill, wit, and self-control, or the lack of it. They also bound the group together. Laughter over a missed throw of Kotobos, or admiration for a brilliant verse, reminded each man that he was part of a community, however fleeting. In the flicker of lamplight, with garlands slipping from their heads, the players of these games tasted both camaraderie and competition, pleasure and pride. The symposium was never only about wine or talk. It was about the unpredictable spark when people mixed seriousness with play, wisdom with excess. And in that blend, the games thrived. Beneath the laughter, the wine, and the clever verses, the symposium pulsed with another force: Eros. Desire was woven into the fabric of the evening, never far from the surface. While wives remained absent, respectable women were not invited into the men's chamber. Other companions often joined. Courtesans, flute girls, and sometimes even young male beloveds moved among the couches, blurring the line between performance and intimacy. For the Greeks, Eros was not simply lust, but a complex bond of attraction, mentorship, and power. A man might dedicate a song, a throw of Kotobos, or even a witty line of poetry to the object of his affection. Love declarations were sometimes playful, sometimes earnest, but always public, staged before the laughter and judgment of peers. In this sense, the symposium acted as both theatre and proving ground for relationships. Hired companions, such as the renowned hetairai, educated courtesans, brought more than beauty. Unlike flute girls who provided fleeting entertainment, hetairai could converse on philosophy, recite poetry, and charm with intellect as well as allure. Their presence lent the evening sophistication, though it also hinted at decadence. These women could shape conversation, flatter egos, and at times wield subtle influence over powerful men. But Eros was not confined to courtesans. The symposium also reflected the Greek tradition of pederasty, where elite men pursued relationships with younger male companions. These bonds, controversial to us today, were seen as vehicles for mentorship, political networking, and expressions of status. Within the walls of the Andron, such dynamics could be openly displayed, courted through gifts, songs, or even contests of loyalty and wit. As the night deepened and wine grew stronger, boundaries loosened. Playful banter might slip into caresses, and public games of wit might end in private encounters. The symposium thrived on this tension between restraint and release, wisdom and indulgence. The god Dionysus, patron of wine, presided over both clarity and frenzy, and the men reclining under his influence often felt they were walking a fine line between the two. In this charged atmosphere, Eros was not an intrusion, but an essential ingredient. It bound music, conversation, and excess into a single current of desire. For the Greeks, to explore love whether sacred, carnal, or philosophical, was to embrace the full complexity of human life. And nowhere did that play out more vividly than in the symposium. While a symposium glittered with music, wine, and desire, it also carried a sharper edge. Politics. Reclining on couches, powerful men could speak with more freedom than in the assembly, plotting alliances, whispering strategies, and gauging who might be friend or rival. The andron, though private, was often more dangerous than the agora, for here reputations could be built or broken over a cup of wine. Politics entered the symposium subtly. A man might begin by reciting lines from Homer, comparing himself to a hero and slyly mocking his opponents. Another might tell a story of recent battles, highlighting his own valour while hinting at the incompetence of others. Wine loosened tongues, but it also provided cover. A risky opinion could be disguised as a joke, a dangerous plan framed as a playful what-if. Yet everyone listening understood the stakes. The host's guest list itself was a political statement. Who reclined beside whom, who was excluded, who received the best wine. All of this sent signals. To be invited was to be recognised, to be left out was a slight. Some gatherings were more about power than pleasure, where plots against rivals were hatched, military campaigns discussed, and friendships secured with laughter and oaths. Philosophy often merged with politics. When Socrates and his circle debated love at a symposium, their words also touched on leadership, virtue, and the nature of authority. To discuss what made a good lover was not far from discussing what made a good statesman. The same skills, charm, persuasion, endurance applied to both. But politics in the symposium was not without risk. A poorly timed boast, a drunken insult, or an overheard conspiracy could ripple outward. Enemies might twist a man's words against him. The intimacy of the andron could nurture alliances, but it could also plant the seeds of rivalry. For many Greek elites, the symposium was not only an escape from duty, but a rehearsal for it. Battles might be fought on fields, laws debated in the assembly, but here, amid garlands, flute music, and cups of diluted wine, the real groundwork of influence was laid. Decisions made in the flickering lamplight of a symposium could echo into the daylight of the polis. For all their claims of moderation, Greek symposia were fragile balancing acts. With enough wine, wit could curdle into insult, games into brawls, and philosophy into farce. Dionysus, god of revelry, always lurked with a smile in the corner, ready to nudge a gathering from brilliance into bedlam. Drunkenness was both expected and feared. A guest too eager with his cup might suddenly forget poetry and politics, slurring insults at rivals or boasting far beyond his worth. Arguments flared quickly when pride was wounded, and fists, or even furniture, could fly. Ancient writers tell us of symposia ending in shattered cups, overturned couches, and guests stumbling into the streets with blackened eyes. What began as a night of refinement could collapse into chaos before dawn. Sexual tensions also stoked disorder. Courtesans and flute girls, objects of affection and competition, sometimes became flashpoints for jealousy. A dedication in Kottabos meant to flatter could spark offence, while a bold advance might escalate into a quarrel. In a room charged with desire, wit and violence were separated only by a thin veil of restraint. The dangers of excess extended beyond bruises. Drunken speech, once dismissed as playful, could return in daylight as evidence. A cutting remark about a magistrate, a whispered conspiracy, or even a careless insult toward a god could destroy reputations. The symposium promised intimacy, but it was never free of risk. What was said in wine did not always stay in wine. Philosophers often warned of this danger. Plato, through the voice of Socrates, argued that drunkenness stripped away reason and corrupted the very purpose of the symposium. Aristotle too remarked on the thin line between the liberation of wine and its ruin. To drink moderately was to loosen the tongue toward wisdom. To drink excessively was to lose control entirely. Yet perhaps this risk was part of the allure. The symposium was not meant to be safe. Its very purpose was to push men into spaces where ordinary rules dissolved, where laughter, lust, and rage mingled freely. Sometimes it produced poetry that echoed for centuries. Other times, it ended in broken noses and bruised pride. Excess was always the shadow of the symposium. Without it, the gathering risked dullness. With it, the gathering risked disaster. The guests never knew which way the night would turn. When dawn crept in and the last lamps flickered out, the symposium left behind more than empty cups and garlands crushed into the floor. It left memories, alliances, bruised egos, and sometimes verses that would outlive their authors. For the Greeks, the symposium was never just a party. It was a mirror of their culture, equal parts wisdom and indulgence, philosophy and pleasure. At its best, the symposium was a crucible of ideas. Here, Plato imagined conversations on love that shaped Western philosophy for centuries. Poets tested new lines before audiences quick to laugh or mock. Politicians rehearsed arguments that would echo later in the assembly. The intimacy of the Andron made it a workshop for thought, where the barriers of public life could briefly fall away. At its wildest, the symposium was a theatre of excess. Wine blurred boundaries, and Dionysus reigned. Guests sang, joked, competed, and sometimes collapsed in a tangle of limbs. The night could end in a masterpiece of verse, or in brawls spilling into the streets. This unpredictability was the essence of the tradition. The symposium was both cultivated and chaotic, sacred and profane, restrained by ritual yet always flirting with disorder. The social lessons ran deep. The symposium reinforced class distinctions, wives and respectable women excluded, slaves serving silently, while elite men reclined as masters of wit and indulgence. It also exposed the fragility of that order, for in drink and desire, masks could slip and truths emerge. To host or attend was to gamble, not only with reputation, but with the possibility of transformation. Though centuries have passed, the allure of the symposium endures. Scholars study its role in shaping philosophy, literature, and politics. Artists depict its reclining figures, cups in hand, in frescoes and vases. And the very idea of mixing conversation, music, and wine lingers in our own social gatherings, though perhaps with less poetry and more noise. In the end, the Greek symposium was a paradox, like the culture that created it. Disciplined yet indulgent, serious yet playful, intellectual yet sensual. Reclining on couches beneath the gaze of Dionysus, the Greeks explored not only pleasure, but also the boundaries of truth, desire, and community. And that mixture of wine and wisdom remains one of their most lasting legacies.